There's a certain type of person who moves through life differently, untouched by the chaos that consumes everyone else, unmoved by the opinions that shape the masses, and unshaken by the storms that break ordinary minds. They don't announce their strength, they don't seek validation, and they certainly don't need your approval. You've seen them, maybe you've envied them, maybe you're becoming one of them. This isn't about cold-heartedness or arrogance. This is about detachment, the silent power that ancient Stoics, Buddhist monks, and modern psychologists all recognize as the ultimate form of mental sovereignty. But here's what most people don't understand. Detachment isn't something you achieve overnight through motivational quotes or weekend retreats. It's a psychological transformation that happens in stages, marked by 8 unmistakable signs that prove you're evolving beyond the reactive, approval-seeking, emotionally dependent person you once were. And if you recognize 5 or more of these signs in yourself, understand this: you're already operating on a frequency that 90% of people will never reach. So let's cut through the noise and examine these 8 psychological markers with brutal honesty, because the truth is, becoming untouchable isn't about building walls, it's about mastering the internal architecture of your mind. The first sign you're developing this silent power is what psychologists call emotional non-reactivity. But let me translate that into reality. You've stopped being a puppet to external circumstances. Think about your past self for a moment. Someone criticized you, and your entire day collapsed. Your boss gave you a sharp look, and you spent hours replaying it in your mind like a broken record. A text message went unanswered, and suddenly you're spiraling into self-doubt and manufactured scenarios. That version of you was exhausting, wasn't it? But now, something fundamental has shifted. The same criticisms come, the same rejections arrive, the same chaos unfolds around you, but inside, nothing. Not numbness, that's depression. Not suppression, that's a ticking time bomb. This is conscious non-identification with outcomes. You've discovered what Carl Jung meant when he said you are not your emotions, you are the observer of them. When someone insults you now, you watch the insult like you'd watch a cloud pass. Interesting, temporary, ultimately irrelevant to who you are. This doesn't make you weak, it makes you dangerous in the most evolutionary sense, because you can't be controlled by emotional manipulation anymore. And in a world where 90% of human behavior is driven by fear, anger, validation seeking, and ego protection, your non-reactivity becomes an invisible force field that people can feel but can't penetrate. The second psychological sign is selective energy investment. And this is where most people fail the detachment test because they confuse it with not caring about anything. Listen carefully, detachment isn't apathy. Apathy is giving up. Detachment is strategic withdrawal from the meaningless so you can go all in on the meaningful. You've started viewing your time, attention, and emotional energy as your most sacred non-renewable resources, and you've become ruthlessly selective about where they go. You no longer attend social gatherings that drain you just to avoid awkward explanations. You no longer engage in arguments with people whose minds are welded shut. You no longer invest emotional labor into relationships that exist only in your effort. The psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi discovered that flow states, those moments of peak performance and deep satisfaction, only occur when you're fully invested in challenges that match your skill level, and you've internalized this at a cellular level. You've realized that society profits from your scattered attention. Social media wants your outrage, advertisers want your insecurity, toxic people want your reaction, and mediocre relationships want your loyalty without reciprocity. But you've opted out of these invisible contracts. You've become what the Buddhists call, in the world but not of it, moving through society's systems without letting those systems define your internal reality. And the people around you notice. They call you distant, selective, even cold, but what they're really sensing is that you've stopped playing the game of performative availability, and it unsettles them because your presence has become valuable again, no longer given freely to whoever demands it. The third sign is outcome independence, which might be the most liberating psychological shift you'll ever experience. Here's what this looks like in practice. You're working on a project with full commitment, but you're not attached to its success defining your worth. You're pursuing a relationship honestly, but you're not devastated if it doesn't work out. You're presenting your ideas clearly, but you're not crushed if people reject them. This is what the Stoics called the dichotomy of control, pouring your excellence into what you can control, your actions and intentions, while maintaining complete indifference to what you cannot control, which is everything else. Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor who had every reason to be attached to outcomes, wrote in his private journal that we should work with what's been given to us, and accept what comes. But outcome independence goes even deeper than Stoic acceptance. It's rooted in modern self-determination theory, which proves that intrinsic motivation, doing something for its inherent satisfaction, produces better results and more sustainable happiness than extrinsic motivation, which is doing something for external validation. You've stopped seeking permission from reality. You've stopped needing circumstances to validate your decisions. You've internalized that your value isn't determined by wins and losses but by the integrity of your process. And paradoxically, this detachment from outcomes often leads to better outcomes, because you're no longer performing from a place of desperate need, you're creating from a place of centered power. People sense this in you. They notice you don't need their approval, which ironically makes them seek yours. They see you're not afraid of failure, which makes them trust your judgment more. You've discovered what every master strategist knows: the person who needs the outcome least usually controls the situation most. The fourth psychological marker is what I call identity fluidity, though researchers term it ego flexibility. You've stopped defending a fixed image of yourself as if your life depends on it, because you've realized that clinging to rigid self-concepts is psychological suicide. Think about how most people operate. They build an identity: I'm the funny one, I'm the responsible one, I'm the rebel, I'm the victim. And then they spend decades defending that identity even when it stops serving them. They reject opportunities because, that's not who I am. They stay in toxic patterns because changing would contradict their self-narrative. They attack anyone who challenges their worldview because their ego has fused with their opinions. But you've experienced something profound. You've watched yourself change. You've held contradictory thoughts without your brain breaking. You've admitted you were wrong about fundamental beliefs without your sense of self collapsing. This is what developmental psychologist Robert Kegan calls self-authoring consciousness, the ability to step back from your thoughts and feelings and recognize them as objects you have, not subjects you are. Neuroscience supports this with research on neuroplasticity, proving your brain physically rewires based on experience, which means the you of 5 years ago is literally a different neural structure than the you reading this now. So why defend the obsolete version? You've stopped saying "I am" statements with religious conviction and started saying, "Right now, I'm experiencing," or "currently, I believe," with scientific openness. This psychological flexibility makes you untouchable because criticism bounces off a moving target, and manipulation can't hook into a self that refuses to be defined by external narratives. You've become what water is to the fist. The harder people try to grasp and define you, the more you slip through their conceptual frameworks, remaining yourself while refusing to be captured by anyone's limited perception, including your own outdated self-image. The fifth sign is radical self-reliance, not to be confused with toxic independence or the inability to accept help. This is the deep psychological knowing that your emotional stability, your sense of meaning, your validation, and your peace cannot sustainably come from external sources. You've tested this hypothesis through painful experience. You achieved the goal and felt empty 2 weeks later. You got the relationship and still felt incomplete. You received the recognition and realized it didn't fill the void you expected it to. What you've discovered is what psychologist Abraham Maslow found in his research on self-actualized people: they have an internal locus of evaluation, meaning they judge themselves by internal standards rather than external feedback. You've built what therapists call a stable internal object, a consistent sense of self-worth that doesn't fluctuate wildly based on who smiled at you today or which opportunity fell through. This doesn't mean you don't value relationships or appreciate support. It means you've stopped outsourcing your emotional regulation to other people. You've stopped making your happiness someone else's responsibility. You've stopped needing constant reassurance that you're on the right path. The existential philosopher Soren Kierkegaard wrote that the most common form of despair is not being who you are, and you've taken this seriously by building your life on the foundation of your own values, not society's script. You've become your own source of approval, your own validation factory, your own meaning-making engine. And this terrifies people who still depend on external validation, because your self-sufficiency reflects their dependency. They'll call you selfish, isolated, or unreachable, but what they mean is, you've stopped needing them to complete you, and that threatens the unspoken contract where they get to feel important by being needed. But you've read the research on codependency, you've studied attachment theory, and you understand that the healthiest relationships are between two complete individuals who choose each other, not two half-people who need each other to feel whole. The sixth psychological sign is temporal detachment, which is your transformed relationship with time itself. You've stopped living in psychological time, that mental space where you're perpetually rehashing the past or rehearsing the future, and you've started operating more frequently in what Eckhart Tolle calls the now. But this isn't New Age mysticism, this is cutting-edge neuroscience. Research shows that depression is predominantly past-focused rumination, while anxiety is predominantly future-focused worry, and the antidote to both is present-moment awareness. You've noticed something remarkable: when you're fully absorbed in the current task, suffering disappears. Not because your circumstances changed, but because suffering requires a narrative that stretches across time. This happened to me, or what if this happens? And when you're genuinely present, that narrative dissolves. You've experienced what athletes call the zone, what artists call a flow, and what monks call meditation, that state where the self-conscious commentator in your head shuts up and you become the activity itself. The psychological benefit is profound. You've stopped carrying the corpses of past mistakes into today, and you've stopped terrorizing yourself with imaginary future catastrophes. This doesn't mean you don't learn from the past or plan for the future. It means you've stopped living there emotionally. Your anxiety has decreased not because your circumstances got easier, but because you've stopped adding fictional layers of suffering onto factual layers of reality. You've internalized what Viktor Frankl discovered in Nazi concentration camps, that the last human freedom is choosing your attitude toward any given set of circumstances. And that freedom exists only in the present moment, never in the unchangeable past or the imaginary future. People notice you've become harder to rattle because you're not haunted by yesterday or terrified of tomorrow. You're just here, dealing with what actually is, and that groundedness in reality makes you psychologically untouchable in a world full of people drowning in mental time travel. The seventh sign is value-based decision-making, which sounds corporate and boring until you realize it's the psychological mechanism that makes you immune to peer pressure, social conditioning, and the endless manipulation of modern life. You've done the difficult internal work of identifying your core values, not the values you inherited from your parents, absorbed from your culture, or adopted to fit in, but the values that genuinely resonate with who you are at your deepest level. Maybe it's truth, freedom, growth, creativity, service, or authenticity. Whatever they are, you've clarified them and now you use them as a decision-making filter for everything. When an opportunity arises, you don't ask, "What will people think?" or "How much money is in this?" as your primary questions. You ask, "Does this align with my core values?" This is what psychologists call values congruence, and research consistently shows it's one of the strongest predictors of life satisfaction and psychological well-being. But here's the deeper power: when you make decisions based on your values rather than external expectations, you become unmanipulable. Advertisers can't shame you into buying their products if you don't value their definition of success. Toxic people can't guilt-trip you into maintaining relationships if you value your peace over their approval. Social media can't trigger your envy if you're measuring your life by your values instead of their highlight reels. You've essentially created an internal compass that points to your true north regardless of how many voices are screaming different directions. And yes, this makes you incompatible with many people, because most people are living values they never consciously chose, following scripts written by others, optimizing for variables they don't actually care about. But you've read the deathbed research. You know that the top regrets are, "I lived the life others expected of me," and "I didn't have the courage to be myself," and you've decided to feel the social discomfort now rather than the soul-crushing regret later. Your detachment from social approval is directly proportional to your attachment to your values, and this trade-off has made you psychologically bulletproof. The eighth and final sign is what I call existential comfort with impermanence, which is the ultimate form of detachment and the one that separates true psychological maturity from surface-level self-help. You've made peace with the fact that everything ends: relationships end, careers end, youth ends, health ends, life ends, and rather than this realization depressing you, it's liberated you. The Buddhists have taught this for 2,500 years through the concept of anicca or impermanence, but modern psychology has caught up through terror management theory, which studies how awareness of mortality influences behavior. Most people live in unconscious denial of death and impermanence, which makes them cling desperately to people, possessions, status, and identities as if holding tight enough will make permanence possible. But you've absorbed the truth that the Stoics meditated on daily: memento mori, remember you will die. And this hasn't made you morbid, it's made you free. You love people more deeply because you know your time with them is finite. You appreciate simple moments because you recognize they're unrepeatable. You take meaningful risks because you've internalized that the biggest risk is reaching the end with your gifts undelivered and your authentic self unexpressed. You've stopped postponing your real life until conditions are perfect because you've realized that impermanence means perfect conditions never arrive and never last. This detachment from the illusion of permanence has given you what the Japanese call mono no aware, a bittersweet appreciation for the transient beauty of existence. And it's made you untouchable in the most profound sense. You can't be threatened with loss by people who don't understand that you've already accepted loss as the fundamental condition of existence. You can't be controlled through fear by a system that doesn't realize you've already confronted the ultimate fear and found peace on the other side. You've become like the samurai who began each day by mentally rehearsing their death, not to become depressed, but to become free, free to act with courage, free to love without possession, free to live without the paralyzing anxiety that comes from pretending anything lasts forever. And this final detachment completes your psychological transformation into someone who is in the world, contributing fully, loving deeply, working passionately, but never again at the mercy of the world's endless fluctuations, because you found the one thing that doesn't change, the awareness that witnesses all change, the consciousness that observes all experience, the silent power that remains untouched regardless of what touches it. That's you now. That's what these 8 signs have been pointing toward. Welcome to a level of psychological freedom that most people spend their entire lives never knowing exists.